welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Felisa Hagens, Secretary of the City Club Board of Governors. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB and watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media sponsors enable us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are continued AARP of Oregon, McKinley Irvin, Irabola Renewables, Providence Health and Services, Uber, and we'd like to welcome a new sponsor this week, Airbnb. Please join me in showing your appreciation for all of them. At next week's Friday Forum, we will present part one of a two-part series on housing. Part one is entitled, Is Portland Facing a Rental State of Emergency? We'll include a panel with Israel Baer, Executive Director of Street Roots, Eli Spivak, founder of Orange Splot, and Nolan Leinhart, Director of Planning and Urban Design for ZGF Architects. We will also hear remarks from the new Portland Housing Director, Kurt Krieger. Please join us here at the Sentinel for this important topic. You can learn more about the City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we'll be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along or join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. Later in today's program, Anna Griffin will facilitate a Q&A session with those live in the audience. Asking questions at the microphone is a privilege of City Club membership, but anyone in the live audience here at the Sentinel may write a question on one of the index cards found at the center of your tables. Hold the card up high, and City Club staff will collect them before or during Q&A session. And now for today's program. By state law, every 6 years, the Metro Council reviews the land supply for the next 20 years, and if necessary, adjusts the region's urban growth boundary to meet anticipated housing and employment land needs. The council will vote on a new 3-year extension in November, following a period for public input. Metro Council President Tom Hughes will speak to the issues involved and then engage in a conversation with Oregonians Anna Griffin about the vote and, more importantly, what's next for the region's growth. Let's welcome Metro President Tom Hughes.
Well, thank you, Felicia. I want to thank the City Club for inviting me today and you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to come today. And I want to particularly recognize 3 of my counselor colleagues who had a day free from listening to me talk about things and yet chose to show up anyway. Craig Dirksen, Sam Chase, and a special thanks to Bob Stacy, who was here on his birthday. So that's so we are at the moment, the 4 of us and our 3 colleagues, wrestling with the issue of what to do about setting the boundary into which Portland will grow, we believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 new residents over the next 20 years. There are people who say, well, why do we grow at all? Why don't we just not grow? Why don't we adopt policies that would discourage growth, that would prevent people from coming? And the answer to that is relatively simple. First of all, it's difficult to do that. Places that have done that have found, among other things, that what happens is the price to live in those communities goes sky high. But on the other hand, there isn't much going on in those communities by way of economic life anyway, so nobody much wants to go there. We have been a region that has enjoyed fairly consistent economic growth, and part of that, at least, is either preceded by or followed by substantial growth in our population. To that end, in 1995, we adopted a a policy called the 2040 Plan, looking forward actually to 2040. We started in 1990. Looking forward to 2040 in terms of what was this area going to look like as we grew over that 50-year period of time. We are now about halfway towards that goal, and we're about 20 years ahead of the planning frame that we use to project what we need for housing, manufacturing jobs, and other employment areas over the next 20 years. So let's look back for a second at 20 years to give you an idea of what that timing frame looks like. So in 1995, Bill Gates introduced Windows 95 and sort of revolutionized the tech industry. Toy Story was the first digitalized feature film that was ever introduced. Some of you will remember this, many of you may not. Modems actually made a noise when you connected to the internet. The world began fiddling around with this thing called the World Wide Web. Within Portland, the Pearl District had yet to take off. There were about 1,000 residents in the Pearl District, which was largely rail yards and old warehouses. Today, there's about 6,000 people living there. As some of you know, my roots are in Hillsborough, where I was mayor for a while. And in 1995, Hillsborough had a population of about 65,000, and it is now approaching 100,000 in the next census. Sherwood, a city of is now a city of about 20,000. Back in 1995 was about 5,000. So if you look at a 20-year planning framework, how do you plan to accommodate those kinds of changes? How do you predict that a Sherwood is going to go from 5 to 20, for example, and provide for the services and just to make the land available for that to happen? So we have looked at that problem for a very long time now. Interestingly enough, I think we're still talking about the same things that we were talking about back in 1995. In 1995, by the way, I was on the Hillsborough Planning Commission, and so I wasn't altogether absent from the discussion, but I certainly didn't play the kind of role that I'm playing now. But we were still talking about the same things, growth and sprawl. How do we grow and not sprawl, as we had seen other regions in the country suffer under growth? The young people in Orange County probably have to study the history of their area in order to find out why it's called Orange County, because they haven't been around to see the orange groves that those of us who got treated to a trip to Disneyland in our youth actually remember the orange groves around Anaheim as we went down there. But we determined then that we didn't want to be that we wanted to be something unique, something uniquely Oregonian. And of course, part of that, sometimes that led to a sort of an anti-outsider point of view. Let's not let anybody in. The Tom McCall famous statement, visit but don't stay, was sort of the theory at the time. And if you remember back, what that did was it generated a tremendous desire of people to come here, because this was this odd place that didn't want them to come. And so, let's go find out what the secret was. So in order to, but among other things, in order to try to get a handle on that growth, to preserve farm and forest land, to keep that farm and forest land in relatively close proximity to urban areas, we established an urban growth boundary. Every city in the state of Oregon has an urban growth boundary. The difference in the Portland metro area is that the 25 cities in the Portland metro area all have a common urban growth boundary, and that urban growth boundary unlike the other cities' boundaries, which are set by the city government, is that boundary, our boundary is set by Metro. And so we have to work on deciding whether or not, and how much and where to expand the urban growth boundary. That process started for us about 3 years ago. And the very first thing that we have to do in order to arrive at that answer is to do some projections on population growth. What we learned a few cycles ago was that we are better off not picking a number, but rather doing a range of possibilities for population growth, and then talk about what the effect on the urban growth boundary would be depending on where on the range we hit. Obviously, the midpoint on the range is the statistically most likely to occur, and so a couple of weeks ago, the council determined that that was where we want to come down on the population growth. So the question then is, how much do we need in the way of land for housing? How much do we need in the way of land for industrial growth? How much do we need in commercial development? And is that land available within the current urban growth boundary? So we began to have conversations with our local jurisdictions. We went out to all 25 cities and 3 counties and sat down with them. Our staff sat down with them, went over their comprehensive plan, had them identify for us developable acreage within their jurisdiction, talk a little bit about what the constraints were on that developable acreage, so that our staff got a really composite picture of what the land availability was like in the region. Then we take a relatively complex but well-reviewed economic model, and we model what we think the economy is going to do over the next 20 years against those comprehensive plans. So it sounds complex and actually is way above my pay grade, but what it comes down to are questions like this. If you wonder whether or not there is going to be, what the balance between multifamily and single family is going to be, project what that balance is going to be, and then look at where there is land zoned to accommodate that market. And so one of the things that happens as a result of doing that is it would appear that a substantial amount of the growth that's going to take place is going to take place within the city limits of Portland, simply because Portland has more land zoned for multifamily development than some of the other jurisdictions in the region do. That, by the way, is not an urban-suburban thing as much as it simply is where the leadership of those cities have gone. So, for example, Hillsborough has a substantial amount of industrial land, first of all, but also high-capacity multifamily residential in areas like Orenco Station and Amber Glen. Amber Glen you won't be familiar with because it hasn't really begun to happen yet, but Orenco Station is going great guns, and looks like the market is driving what the city of Hillsborough said they wanted to have happen in Orenco, just as the market appears to be driving what the city of Portland said they wanted to happen in the Lloyd District, in the Central East Side. Those areas are hot markets right now, and they are really developing rapidly. Our numbers project that trend will continue for the life of the 20 years that we're studying. The result of that is that when we look at that model, it leads us to the conclusion that we don't have a need to expand the urban growth boundary. We have adequate supplies of land both for housing and for industrial and other economic growth, so we can grow the houses and the jobs within the urban growth boundary over the next 20 years without expanding the urban growth boundary. Now, Having said that, we're all a little nervous about those projections. And one of the reasons for that you have to be aware of is that Metro has never not expanded the urban growth boundary. So in all of the urban growth boundary decisions that we've made in the past as an agency, the decision always was to expand the urban growth boundary somewhat. And so to come up, to have a result that says we don't have to expand the urban growth boundary at all is a little unusual for us. And part of that is because we believe that there are unusual demographic changes taking place in society that probably are going to be long-term. And so we think going forward that we're going to see dramatic changes in terms of what this area is going to look like, particularly with that balance between multifamily and single family. Portland right now, the Portland area, for example, is about 70-30. So about 70% is single family, 30% is multifamily. We think that in 2035, that will have shifted to about a 60-40 mix. So 60% will be single family, 40% will be multifamily. And that's a significant shift and a significant amount of multifamily that would be constructed over the next few years in order to do that. So as we go forward, we think that a handful of really dynamic neighborhoods are really going to take off. So the Lloyd district, as I mentioned before, where I work, if you look out the window, you can see 13 cranes building about somewhere between 3,000 or 4,000 units of multifamily housing in that district, which has, quite frankly, been an underachieving district economically in the past. I mentioned Durango Station. There are other developments around the region that are beginning to take off, and other things that cities had always held as aspirational goals that are beginning to happen, in part because of this market change. So if you haven't had a chance to go to downtown Milwaukee recently, take a visit out to Milwaukee and see what kinds of economic changes are taking place in downtown Milwaukee, and you'll find a community that is benefiting from an increase in vibrancy, and they're making some significant changes that will catch that wave, I think, into the future. Part of what's happening, by the way, is that many of us who are boomers are beginning to tire of our single-family home with a lawn that we have to either mow or have mowed. Having had my one grandchild is now in college, so it's very hard to get my lawn mowed anymore. Not that it was easy when he was home, but it is even harder now. And so, like many other baby boomers, my wife and I have talked recently about the prospect of moving. And if we were to move, it wouldn't be into another single-family home. It would be probably into some multifamily complex someplace, either a senior living or just just an apartment. And many of us are doing that. We're not alone in thinking about that. And those of you who have followed or studied demographics for a long time are aware of the fact that the baby boomers are one of the largest generations to ever come through that curve. And so whatever we do has profound impact on economic forces. So the fact that probably about the same percentage of us are now beginning to look for multifamily experiences, we just are a lot more, there's a lot more of us doing that than with other generations. So there is this demand at the senior level for more multifamily. On the other hand, baby boomers, not baby boomers, but millennials are different from us in a number of ways. In some ways, they're very similar to us. We believe that when when millennials start having families, they too will begin to desire to move into single-family homes. But what we're noticing about them from a demographic standpoint is that is happening to them much later in their lives than it is now, than it was with our generation, than it was with the generations that have come between us. And so, again, we think that trend will continue as that cohort marches into the economic life of the country, and that will show a downturn, immediate downturn in the demand for single-family houses, and again, an uptick as fewer of them leave their multifamily existence. One of the things, even when they do have families, some of you may remember the discussion that took place around the Pearl District, that Portland Public always said, well, we don't need to build a school in the Pearl District because those folks won't have kids, and once they have kids, they'll move out into the suburbs. They are now talking about how do we retrofit the Pearl with a school, because they have a significant number of school-age kids living in the Pearl in those high-rise apartments that now they're beginning to contemplate a school. And so those kinds of changes we think are going to produce what we're seeing in terms of more shift towards multifamily, and therefore therefore the land that we have within the urban growth boundary should be sufficient to meet the capacity needs for the region until 2035. We're nervous enough about that, though, that our proposal is that we start the process of looking at that again sooner rather than later. So we are required by law to do it. Actually, the law changed, so we're now required by law to do it every 5 years. We think that we need to start almost as soon as this one is done, beginning to gather the information, because we want to see if it makes any difference the further we get away from the recession. So the recession may have altered our numbers somewhat in ways that we don't completely understand. And so 2 or 3 years later, we may be able to see some glimmer of a different direction than we thought that was going to go. Our goal, though, has been always to work with our local partners to build our plans off of their plans and to model them as close to reality as we can. We constantly check our models against other professionals to make sure that they're valid, and we think that what we've got is the most valid proposal. So proceeding from here, the council last night opened the first hearing on the COO's, our Chief Operating Officer's recommendation that we not expand the urban growth boundary. We didn't have much testimony last night. We will have 2 other hearings, and then sometime in November the council will vote as to whether to accept that report. And at that point then, by the end of the year, we will, if we accept the report by the end of the year, we will then declare that this process is over and that there will not be an expansion of the urban growth boundary. Now, obviously, I should say, not oddly, but obviously, that has created a bit of controversy. And so it is around that controversy, I suspect that we may see some questions this afternoon. But I'm going to wait for those questions and answer them as they come up. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your listening to this dialogue.
Good afternoon. I am Anna Griffin with the Oregonian and OregonLive.com, and I am here at the Portland City Club's Friday Forum. We're going to talk about the urban growth boundary and what the region is going to look like with Tom Hughes, President of the Metro Council. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Anna.
The first question I have is, affordability is the paramount issue facing this region today, whether we are talking about homelessness among the poorest of the poor, the working class being priced out of the rental market, or this wave of demolitions to make way for infill in some of our more historic upscale neighborhoods. The city of Portland gets most of the heat for not doing things to stop a housing crisis, but I wonder, what is Metro's role in this? And are there things looking back over the past few years that you guys didn't do that maybe you should have?
Well, affordability is a fairly complex issue, and there's a number of elements to it. One of those elements we know is the price of land. And so the system that we have evolved has a tendency to potentially impact the price of land, obviously, if you limit the supply. So part of the reason why we do this periodically is to make sure that the impact on the price of land is minimal. In terms of what we did in the past that might be a mistake, I think that that the land use system itself contributes marginally to the problem, the crisis with affordability, and I think going forward, it will even be more marginal. For example, some of the data that our projections show is that 60% of the households that'll be moving into Portland, in the Portland area in the next 20 years, will be 2- and 3-member households, and that they will have an average an average household income of $25,000 to $35,000. That's that is hardly enough to get affordable housing. I mean, that when we talk about housing affordability, it is that blue-collar, working-class housing affordability where I think we really have a crisis that's a little bit hidden. So I mean, we know that the people who are desperately poor and that we see on every freeway interchange in the area, that they have a housing crisis. We understand that. I think it's harder to understand the struggle that a lot of young working class kids are going through right now, just to keep houses over their heads, and so we're going to start. We put some money into some staff folk to begin to see about coordinating some sort of an effort around the region to try to address that issue, and we're really in the early days of that.
Let's go back for a second and talk more specifically about the urban growth boundary. It raises real estate prices to limit supply, right?
It raises land prices. And I think that the difference between raising land prices and raising housing prices are two different things. We won't know yet for sure, but the developments that I'm familiar with. So if you look at the North Bethany development, they're building single-family houses, and I'm going to guess that they're selling in the $350,000, $400,000 range. Those folks wound up paying about $250,000 an acre for land. So divide that by 8, and it gives you sort of what the land costs were. South Hillsborough is about to come on the market. My guess is that a house in South Hillsborough will range somewhere a little bit less than $350,000, but somewhere between $300,000 and $350,000. Those folks paid $17,000 an acre for their land prices. And yet the prices of the houses don't really reflect the difference in the land cost. So what I'm saying is that it is more complex. I think cities, counties, and even Metro add to the cost of housing almost more through the regulatory and fee process than we do by forcing up the price of land.
So what do we do about that?
About the fees? Yeah. The difficulty of, because I can be a little sanctimonious about it because we don't really charge a whole lot of fees and we don't issue permits. But I understand what cities are going through because that growth demands some infrastructure. And in order to pay for the infrastructure, you have to put that burden on somebody. And the choices, as you sit there as a city official, the choices are two. You can tax the people who are already here, or you can tax the people who are coming. So you can charge it by an increase in property tax, which raises the property tax on everybody, or you can demand that it be charged as a system development charge and be paid as people move in. It's very interesting because the people who aren't here yet are seldom likely to vote for your opponent. But I mean, and also you could argue that the people who already live here have already paid for those services, so you're asking them now to pay again. So there's a lot of different reasons why those fees are there, and I do think that there needs to be at every level a constant searching as to whether or not those fees are absolutely necessary, and also on the part of all of us a discussion about what other sources of revenue could we find to build infrastructure.
One of the fundamental principles of our land use system built into the urban growth boundary is that density is a good thing. And you talked about the increasing percentage, particularly in the city of Portland, of the population that's going to be choosing multifamily housing. And that, again, presumes that density is a good thing. What we're seeing in many neighborhoods across Portland, what we will soon be seeing in more neighborhoods across Beaverton, Hillsborough, Milwaukee, maybe even Oregon City, is conversations between existing residents and those folks who are coming about what neighborhoods look like. How do you convince people currently living in single-family neighborhoods who like their tree-lined streets, who like being able to find parking, that density is a good thing?
Well, again, the density, it would be fairly easy, again, for me to just say, yeah, that's really up to the local governments. But it's a problem that impacts our ability to gain support for the kind of land use planning that we really believe has created the vibrancy that we've got here. I think, just my druthers, and supported by, I think, the housing preference study that a group of us did, that a wide variety of housing types is important for the health of a region and a neighborhood. The problem with that is that when you zone a parcel for residential, quite often the market drives that residential at the most dense that it can possibly be. And so similarly in terms of infill, a single family home on a large lot may be a target for being torn down with two houses built in its place. So you still wind up with detached single family, but it's way more crowded into neighborhoods that aren't used to that kind of crowding. Again, one of the things we explored out in Hillsborough were historic overlay zones, where we exempted particular neighborhoods from density as long as they maintained their houses and the sort of the historic nature that they did, and whatever infill there was, we required that it be consistent with the houses. I think there's some things like that local governments can look at, but there is no silver bullet on that.
One of the underlying principles of the land use system we have is that different communities will get along, that cities will work together, that regionalism will be something we embrace. Given that so many of these problems we face right now, affordability, protecting the environment by getting people out of their cars, figuring out where the jobs are going to go and how we attract them, are regional in nature. Given that, how do you solve the political problem as Clackamas County?
In 20 words or less. Yeah, I think that I think that Clackamas County is experiencing some of the struggles, and maybe just the tip of an iceberg. Some of the protests down at Portland City Hall of late about infill might indicate that there are Portlanders who don't want to engage in Portland creep. I just think that it has become fashionable and political in that particular jurisdiction to use Metro and Portland as a political whipping boy, and it seems to be a successful thing to do. Interestingly enough, there are cities in Clackamas County that have really good leadership and are very collaborative and work together really well, so I think there's hope. There's hope for all of us. You know, as a region, we can't afford to have one county not achieving economically, and the numbers in Clackamas County show that they do tag behind some of the rest of the region in terms of economic growth, and we really need to struggle and collaborate with them to close that gap so that economic success goes to all parts of the region.
Just a reminder, I am Anna Griffin from the Oregonian and OregonLive.com, and I'm here at City Club's Friday Forum talking about the urban growth boundary and the future of the region with Metro Council President Tom Hughes. One of the points that Martha Bennett makes in her urban growth boundary report, and with the recommendation not to expand it, is that we have enough land already inside the boundary for the economic growth and the housing growth that we're going to need in the years to come. Are there spots that you look at, particularly in terms of economic development, that are just underutilized? Are there specific places that you look at and go, we need to be doing something right there?
Well, we have a number of areas in the region that I think are being I'm very optimistic about. The opening of the Orange Line down into Milwaukee has opened up an interesting opportunity for an industrial area in North Milwaukee that I think is going to be really exciting, in part because if you kind of ask the question that some of us have started to ask, which is, so what impact is the night challenge going to have on the economy of the Portland area? What one would hope would happen is that the research being done up at OHSU will create or promote the creation of jobs in allied industries in close proximity to that research. The first place, obviously, that people hope it'll go is South Waterfront. Land prices in South Waterfront are a little steep, so you could walk across the Tillicum Bridge and be in Central East Side, where they aren't so steep. So we think that some of the benefit is going to spill over into Central East Side. But then, if you want to do something bigger, there is this industrial area in North Milwaukee that is actually bigger than Ronler Acres out in Hillsborough, that is not far from being shovel-ready in terms of welcoming some of those companies that might be moving there, and they're a 25-minute Orange Line ride away from catching the tram up to OHSU. So that's one area. Between Wilsonville and Tualatin, for example, there's an area called Basalt Creek that I think obviously offers some opportunity. Part of the problem there is there's a working gravel quarry right in the middle of it, but as that begins to play out and as other investments are made in terms of transportation infrastructure, I think that will take off. Willamette Falls Heritage Project, which we're working on with Oregon City and Clackamas County, is a great opportunity for us to take advantage to one of the real gems in Oregon that almost no one ever sees, which is Willamette Falls. And we're going to do a public project of a walk-around where the old Blue Heron site used to be. But there is a private developer that's going to develop the land where the mill used to be, and we think that that's going to offer us an opportunity for a bunch of jobs. So there's a ton of that kind of stuff. There's still land out in Hillsborough. Beaverton's got sites. We really need to begin to work together as a region through Greater Portland Inc. to figure out how to market those sites better.
How has your perspective on the role of Metro and the challenges of regionalism changed since you got this job?
Yeah, I keep getting that question asked from folks at home too. Well, they usually include Kool-Aid somewhere in that discussion. Well, you know, as I have told them, you'd have to have a pretty low opinion of me if I didn't change positions and not change my view of the way things work. Also, I think that Metro has, over the last few years, and I will only take credit for the last little bit of it, has sort of evolved into an agency that is less likely to say, here's a problem, what regulations do we need to impose in order to solve that problem, to an agency that says, here's a problem, what is everybody in the region doing to try to solve this problem? And so let's ask them, and then maybe sit down with everybody and share ideas and see if there isn't some sort of a regional solution to that. I think that that's a much healthier way to look at regionalism, because the reality is, which I actually believed even when I was mayor of Hillsborough, but the reality is we all do better if we work together. And interestingly enough, even though we're close enough to see where the warts and blemishes are, from the outside world, we are viewed as a place who really gets it in terms of collaboration, that we are one of the most collaborative places. I mean, people actually take tours to come here to study how we do our collaborative work. And so I think, those of us who are here have to kind of not be so hard on ourselves about being able to do that. I mean, there are some people who are easier to work with than others, but for the most part, everybody is interested in moving their jurisdiction ahead, and almost everybody understands that we can do that better working together than we can working at odds with each other.
You mentioned what the Pearl District was 20 years ago, and I'm curious, as you and your wife think about the future, I'm looking for a real estate tip here. Where are you going to buy the condo? What's the next Pearl?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We decided that we were gonna move into an apartment on the park blocks, and to that end, we got season tickets to the symphony, joined a downtown church, and got very involved in stuff going on in downtown Portland. We decided before we could sell our house, we had to fix it up. So we redid the kitchen and we put a deck on the back of it. And when we got all through, we said, boy, this is pretty comfortable. Maybe we'll just stay here for a while. And about that time, I got elected mayor, and it was then pretty hard to move. And even now, quite frankly, having been elected to this job as the guy who wasn't from Portland, I kind of think that it would be a problem for me if I then moved into Portland.
You don't want to run for Portland mayor?
No, ma'am. You all have a mayor, and you have other people who quest after that job, and that's fine for me.
When you first ran, you ran as the economic development candidate, and I wonder, given all of the changes in the region in the past few years, given how much more aware we are now of the lasting impact of the recession on income gaps, on affordability, has your definition of economic development changed?
The funny thing is it hasn't, and the unfortunate, that's the good news and the bad news, because we still have the same hurdles. The biggest hurdle that we have in terms of, not so much in terms of economic development, in terms of growing more jobs, but of having the impact of those jobs be felt by people who actually live here. The biggest problem we have is our education system. And I remain concerned about an education system, not just Portland public, but statewide, region-wide, certainly, that consistently fails communities of color and creates an achievement gap at the very moment when those communities of color are in the process of becoming the majority of the kids in the school. And if that gap continues to stay where it is, and those demographics continue to apply, we're going to be in a great deal of difficulty selling our workforce to any potential employer as a quality workforce where they can go and find kids who can do the jobs that they need to have done. So we really need to address the issue of education. And my temptation, as with I think too many of us, is to say, thank God that's somebody else's problem. But the reality is it is kind of all of our problem, and I think we all need to figure out how we're going to work together to solve that problem. So that's where we start. The thing that I have changed a little bit on is, I used to believe that our economic prosperity depended on expanding the urban growth boundary, so we had lots of industrial land. We've got now a 50-year supply of land designated an urban reserve, and there's only one 100-acre site outside the urban growth boundary right now that would be suitable for industrial growth. So expanding the urban growth boundary is not the way we're going to increase our land supply and improve our economic position. It's going to have to be investing in infrastructure, doing brownfield remediation, doing wetlands remediation, and consolidating ownerships to make those areas that are already in the urban growth boundary shovel ready and ready to go.
I want to ask you how you pay for education fixes, but that's another Friday forum, I think. I am Anna Griffin with the Oregonian and OregonLive.com, and we are here at City Club's Friday Forum with Tom Hughes, Metro Council President. It is time now to open it up to the Q&A portion of the program. If you have a written question on an index card, hold it up very high so City Club staff can get to it. We're going to take questions from the audience. As always, City Club invites members to the microphone to ask their questions. Asking questions at the Friday Forum mic is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your questions in 30 seconds or less, and we'll get to at least one index card question.
So can they ask questions of either of us? Or?
You're the one on the hot seat here.
This question is directed towards President Hughes. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm Jason Miner, City Club member and Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Oregon. You referenced the Housing Preference Survey and market forces and a lot of things to which the region reacts in looking at the urban growth boundary. I'm interested in what can you do in your leadership role at Metro to proactively advance the 2040 vision, a very powerful vision that too often the city of Portland bears the brunt of carrying, trying to build density along corridors and centers, a beautiful part of that vision. What can Metro do as a leader to further the 2040 goal, or further the 2040 vision, and to, in your leadership role, get us to a place where in 2018, we're celebrating a doubleheader of two urban growth boundary decisions in which there's no expansion?
Thank you, Jason. First of all, I think that the idea that Portland bears the brunt of the 2040 plan, as it is developed, is a Portland view. One of the things that has intrigued me over the time is that almost every community in the Portland metropolitan area has developed a 2040 plan or a comp plan that is very much consistent with the 2040 plan. And we've seen a number of places where they have begun to really develop those plans. We spend quite a bit of money and construction excise tax money to promote planning that is 2040 sensitive planning, and I think that we've done a fair amount to promote that in all jurisdictions. Portland gets the brunt. Portland's the central city, and so it's where on our plan the bulk of the growth is going to come. But if you look at and again, my other experiences with Hillsborough, two-thirds of the population growth of Hillsborough over the lifetime of the West Side light rail has been in light rail stations, clustered around light rail stations and along corridors. Even when they expanded, as they just did out in South Hillsborough for a residential area, it was designated as a town center so that it could be planned and developed as a 2040 center. So I think the message of 2040 is around. The biggest problem that we have, and Michael Jordan articulated it very well before he left to go to the state, and that is that we do not have, we've got $20 billion worth of investments to make in order to make 2040 a reality, and we will not have anywhere close to that kind of money available to invest in infrastructure. So part of it is going to be a constant drumbeat towards figuring out a way to get the infrastructure financing that we need to promote that. And I'm not willing yet to say that we'll not expand but
Let me ask one from an index card, Tom, because this follows up on the comments you made when we were talking about the public schools and equity. How has equity, especially for people of color in poverty, been considered in recent growth boundary policy discussions?
Well, we certainly considered it in terms of, it was considered sort of tangentially, I think, in many respects. We've been struggling with our role in bringing equity to the region, and there are some, and I think struggling actually to still try to understand what land use planning decisions, how land use planning decisions affect communities of color and the distribution of racial diversity and poverty around the region. You know, one of the things that has happened here, and I used to attribute it a little bit to the urban growth boundary, is that poverty has now been pretty evenly spread to the suburbs. So Portland has a level of people in need of housing, but so do Hillsborough, Beaverton, Gresham, and all of the suburban communities. I'm not as sure that that's true anymore because it seems to be happening in every urban area in the country. I don't know. I mean, we are now beginning to consider equity in every decision we make, but I've never heard a good case made for expansion or not expansion affecting the communities of color.
Let's take one from the microphone.
Thank you. Greg DiLoretto, City Club member. So how is the fact that the Damascus area not living up to the expectation that it would develop affect the urban growth boundary conversation?
Interesting history. When the history of Damascus is written, it will be a very short book, but it will be an interesting book. And I think part of what's happening in Damascus, it reminds us again that when Damascus was designated as for urban growth boundary expansion, it was not a city. And part of what has happened in Damascus that has prevented its development is that rules have been enacted by the city that prevent it from creating the sort of planning tools that you need in order to do development. That said, and so there has been an argument that we just should say, well, Damascus isn't going to develop for the next 20 years, take it out altogether. But the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, created a process by which citizens in Damascus who owned property could de-annex from Damascus and annex to Happy Valley and move their property into a place that was able and willing to develop it. There is an election coming up next year, I believe it is, maybe next May, to disincorporate the city of Damascus. At that point in time, then I think the development of the land that's in the urban growth boundary, the bulk of it will then come under the rules of Clackamas County, and some people may actually annex to either Gresham or Happy Valley in order to develop. So I think a lot more of that is going to develop than we would have said 2 years ago, for example, but not as much as they thought when they first brought it in back almost 20 years ago. And I think there's a whole portion of it that may never develop, but certainly not without a substantial amount of investment on infrastructure.
Let's take one more question from the microphone.
My name is Catherine Nikolovsky. I'm a City Club member. So one focus of this conversation surrounds the link between the urban growth boundary, the price of land and real estate prices. Oregon Metro maintains the Regional Land Information System, which our list database contains quite a rich amount of data that could help shed light on the complexities of the of our urban environment. I'm wondering if someone were to be interested to do more research and actually look at some of the link between real estate value and how land is being valued as we start to expand the urban growth boundary. Is that easy to find information?
Yeah, I'm getting a nod from the people up here who know. I'm not. I mean, it wouldn't be easy if you called me and said, "Can you go find that for me?" But if you did call me and say, "Could you go find that for me?" I would direct you to somebody who could go find that for you and let you know how to hook into that. I think that might be interesting research to look at. So.
Do we have one more question from the microphone?
Hi, Claire Dennerlein Manson, City Club member. I'm going to shine the spotlight a little bit on one of our sponsors today. And we know that land rates definitely account for some portion of housing prices and housing values, but roughly 20% in some of the mixes I've seen. Given that the system of Airbnb has allowed homeowners to garner so much more money than, say, a longer term or more traditional rental, and that it's also more flexible, and that do you see, or at least that these rates could maybe signal to real estate speculators to redevelop an area, cause rental increases in a more overt way? And do you think that these rates can be an indicator of future displacement within incredibly popular pressurized urban areas?
See, I thought you told me there wouldn't be any math. That's okay. I think that what we're seeing in terms of the price, and this is not going to answer your question because I'm not sure I altogether understood your question, but I think that what's happening in terms of the rental increases is that you've got a 2% vacancy rate. So, for part of that is because for about 5 years, nobody built any apartments. And for a while before that, they were building condos because, so making the conversion from condo over to apartment has not been as easy as possible. I just think that at some point in time, and part of the thing is these things, it's not a steady curve, it's a up and down. So, 5 years from now, we may be talking about all those empty apartments around and the rental prices will come down. But if that's true, then they'll go back up again. But right now, I've never seen the apartment market as hot as it is now. I'm sorry.
I have one more question from an index card from a very well-informed guest. While I receive the Metro monthly newsletters, I would suspect that 4 out of 5 residents are completely uninformed of Metro's duty. They cite running the zoo, building the convention center hotel, running the convention center. What can you do to better educate the electorate? And I think I would add to that, do you think your constituents understand what Metro is?
No. In fact, not only don't I think that, I think we have polling data over the years that indicate that it's true. I've tried appearing half nude on the Willamette Week cover. I've tried appearing in the Tribune as a garden gnome thing. I don't know how much more I could do to attract attention to Metro. Not that I think that necessarily explains what we do, but it might lead people to say, "What does this guy do?" I've not really found that happens. Part of it is that what we do is right around the edges of the wonky nature of government. Other than running the zoo, which is about as unwonky as you can get, and even running the zoo has a whole wonky side that nobody wants to know much about. So, it is just difficult to do that. I was on the Hillsborough City Council when we did our comprehensive plan. We had 64 public hearings on our comprehensive plan, and we had 69 people total showed up at those 64 public hearings, and 64 of them were the same guy who had a parcel of land. And so, People are interested in land use planning when it directly affects them. It's harder to get them involved when it's further out, the sort of visioning part.
We have run out of time, broadcast time, for further questions, and we'll have to stop for today. I'd like to thank our moderator, Anna Griffin from the Oregonian, Metro Councilor Tom Hughes, and the staff here at the Sentinel Hotel for their hard work in delivering the City Club luncheon.